Good evening, gentlemen. We are learning chapter 10 of the second part of the Tanya. We are discussing Hashem's emanated wisdom. We are discussing the wisdom of God and God's relationship to His own wisdom. As we know and as we mentioned many times now, His wisdom is important because His wisdom is the Torah, right? That's one way of thinking about it. One way of thinking about Hashem's wisdom, as we're describing it, is the Torah itself. So really, in a sense, we're discussing the relationship between Hashem and His Torah. And we explained that really this is a relationship that's impossible to understand. That's what we read at the end of chapter 9. We said the relationship of Hashem to His wisdom, the relationship of Hashem to His Torah, is the Raza de Mehem Nusa. It is a secret of faith. We cannot understand it. It is something that faith alone can know, that the soul knows at the level beyond rationality, beyond a logical intellect, and what the logical intellect can grasp. Why is it so difficult to understand? We explained last chapter. Because His wisdom is emanated, but He is also infinitely removed from it. And these two things are really a contradiction. On the one hand, His wisdom is emanated, which means what is it? It's an expression of Him. It's an expression of Him Himself. That's what His wisdom is. On the other hand, can Hashem be expressed in wisdom? No, Hashem is not a being of wisdom. Hashem is infinitely above, infinitely removed from wisdom and from being understood. He's not even in the realm of understanding. So how can Hashem, who is infinitely beyond understanding, express Himself in wisdom? This is what's called the Raza de Mehem Nusa, the secret of faith, the thing that cannot be understood. That's what we learned at the end of chapter 9. And then in chapter 10, the Alter Rebbe says immediately that even though this is a secret of faith, nevertheless, we're going to try and understand it a little bit, even though it's something that cannot be understood. That's what the Alter Rebbe says. He says, it cannot be understood, it's faith only. And he says in a very interesting way, he says that the students, the teachers of Kabbalah, the great Kabbalists, the great Tzaddikim, were given permission to speak about Kabbalah in a certain language, to speak about Kabbalah using certain descriptions and certain names. In other words, even though these are things that are fundamentally not comprehensible. So you should really, in theory, you shouldn't be able to give it a name, because to give anything a true name just about is to understand it. Most things a name, because names work in a certain metaphorical sense, as we're going to see in a minute. So to even really speak about these things with a name is really, in a sense, to lower them from what they really are, which is not understandable, not comprehensible. Nevertheless, the Kabbalists were given permission to smooth it over for our ears, to make it good for the human ear. The Torah speaks in the language of human beings. And they call the divine emanation, including Hashem's wisdom, all of the levels that are emanated, that are shone out by Him, is called what? They're called light. Eres. Hashem's wisdom is called His light. Why is it called His light? Not because it really shares anything in common with physical light. Not really, anyway, as we're going to see. And nevertheless, there is this certain property that light has that helps us understand a little bit, in some way, the way that Hashem is united with His own wisdom, the way that Hashem is united with the Torah. We explored, good evening. We explored how Hashem is united with His wisdom in a way of light by comparing what we said back in chapter 3 of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah to what we're saying here in chapter 10. Because back in chapter 3, we were also talking about light, the ray of the light, the ray of the sun, in the sun is what we were talking about back in chapter 3. And over here, we're also talking about light, and we're also talking about the ray of the sun in the sun. But back in chapter 3, we were actually saying not just something different with the metaphor, we were actually saying the opposite idea from the ray of the sun in the sun to what we are saying here. Because back in chapter 3, we weren't talking about Hashem's wisdom. We weren't talking about His chachma, His emanated traits, His self-expression. We were talking about the creation, the world around us as we know it, Not his emanated expression, but the creation that is separate from him. The creation that is separate from him is like the ray of the sun in the sun, which what's it a metaphor for? It's a metaphor for how the creation never leaves its source, which is the divine words that create it. What does this mean in other words? It means that the creation is nothing. The creation has no existence of its own on its own terms, right? This table does not actually exist as a table on its own terms. All the table is Hashem speaking the word shulchan. That's all it is. There is nothing else to the table except Hashem speaking it. So the table on its own terms is nothing. The table, you ask, what is the table itself? Not just the words that speak it into existence. The answer is, there is no table itself.
We did say that the table is actually the essence of God.
What?
We did say that the table is the essence of God.
No, we didn't. When?
Essence of God? Yeah, but there's...
When?
Not yesterday, but...
Back when we learned chapter 3. I don't think so. The point is not that it's the essence of God. The point is not even that it's one with Hashem. The point is that the table for itself has no existence at all on its own terms, right? In other words, the table as a table does not exist. There is only the word shulchan that Hashem is constantly speaking. There is no table as a table, right? The way we described it, I reminded you last week, is that it's a process without a result, right? Hashem is constantly speaking the table into existence, and what is the existence of the table? The process of speaking it into existence. There is never a point at which the table actually exists as a result of the process. There is only the process which speaks it into existence, right? So the table on its own terms exists or doesn't exist? The answer is it doesn't exist. On its own terms, there is nothing on its own terms. There is only the divine speech speaking it into existence.
Which is happening every time. But isn't
at every moment.
Yeah. But isn't it that everything which is like exists, in a way, in this world is like having essence of God in it?
I don't know what that means. Maybe
what is the soul piece of any element?
What? Sorry?
The soul piece of any element.
The soul piece of any
the soul,
element.
it's like, every element has...
we're talking not just about the soul, we're talking even about the physical aspect of every element.
But this is part of the essence of God, which is in it.
So what is not part?
I don't know where that's from. I'm not familiar with this idea that everything has the essence of God in it necessarily. I'm not familiar. I don't know.
It's almost by definition because it was created by God.
Yes, but the thing is, it's not. That's not the table. That's the source of the table you're describing, I think. But it's not a piece of the essence of God. It's Hashem speaking the table into existence. It's not the essence of Hashem. It's Hashem's speech, right? But the thing is that so that's Hashem's speech. Hashem's speech is the soul of the table, right? That's not the essence of God. It's just Hashem's speech. But the thing is not whether the speech is an expression of Hashem, which may or may not be the case. A more complicated question. The question is, without looking at what creates it or its source in godliness, I want to know what the thing is itself. The answer is that there is no itself. There is only the source in godliness. That's the entire point. That's the entire point that was made in chapter 3. The point got significantly more complicated as we went to chapter 4, 5, 6, and 7, but that was the nakuda of this idea. The nakuda, the central point was that the thing for itself does not exist. There is only Hashem speaking it into existence. In chapter 10, we are saying the opposite about Hashem's wisdom, not about the table or the creation, but about the Torah, Hashem's wisdom itself. Hashem's wisdom itself is like a ray of the sun in the sun. But by that we do not mean that it is nothing on its own terms. On the contrary, what we mean is that on its own terms, it is Ein Sof. It is the infinite expression of Hashem. In other words, rather than being nothing themselves, they are themselves pure godliness. They are a pure expression of Hashem as He is. That is the way they are a ray of the sun in the sun, right? And we explained last week the difference between the two metaphors. How can you have one metaphor for two opposite concepts? And the answer is that it's really not one metaphor. Really, they're subtly different. In chapter 3, when we discussed the ray of the sun in the sun, we were discussing the sun as more like a flintstone. is how we described it last week. The Flintstone has fire in it in some way, right? But the truth is that fire cannot exist in the Flintstone because the Flintstone is a stone, right? Similarly, when we were describing the sun in chapter 3, light cannot exist in the sun because it's the sun. The sun is there. There can't be light there, right? Here in chapter 10, we're describing the sun differently. There's one key word that indicates the difference, and the key word is ma'or, luminary. The sun is defined here in chapter 10 as a source of light. In other words, the sun is not a place where light cannot exist, the way that fire cannot exist in a stone because it's a stone. Right? The sun is, on the contrary, a place of light. That's what the sun is, right? It's not contradictory to the existence of light. On the contrary, it is the existence of light. The light's whole purpose is to reveal the sun, and the sun's whole purpose is to shine. And within the sun, these two things are actually one thing, which is why the Alter Rebbe says that when do we call light light under the chapter 10 definition? It's only called light when it makes day, right? It's called light when it makes daytime. In other words, when it is illuminating things outside of its source. When it is within its source, it's not even called light. What's it called? Ma'ar. It's called luminary. Within the sun, the light and the sun are totally one. There's no distinction between the two. Within the sun, all there is sun. Not because the light isn't there, because the light is there. But how is the light there? The light is there as the sun, right? As opposed to in chapter 3, as we explained, back in chapter 3, light is called light everywhere, whether it is outside the sun or inside the sun. Why? Because light is always its own existence, right? All we mean when we say the ray of the sun in the sun is that the light isn't really here. The light is not here. The light really begins at the surface of the sun. What's in the sun is just, gas or whatever the sun is made of, right? That's what we meant in chapter 3. Because we were looking at the sun not as a source of light, but as a physical body, a physical substance of some sort, right? Here in chapter 10, we're saying differently. We're saying the light is called light everywhere. I should put it slightly differently. The light is everywhere, right? Both outside and inside the sun. Only within the sun, it's not called light. It's called luminary. It's called ma'ar. It's called the source of light. Therefore, as we concluded last week's class, in Chassidus, in the way of the Alter Rebbe, we treat the world and Torah very differently one from one another, right? When we look at the world, what is the inherent nature of the world? The inherent nature of the world is nothing on its own terms, right? The world's nature is to be nothing. There is no table. There's only Hashem speaking the world shulchan into existence. So when a chassid, a student of the Alter Rebbe, deals with the world, how does he deal with it? He is always looking for its divine source, right? The thing on its own terms is simply an illusion. And that's how a chassid treats the world, right? For example, when a chassid goes to work, he doesn't go to work because he needs to make money. That's operating within the, for its own sake, we should say, which is operating within the confines of the worldly reality. He goes to work because Hashem commands that he should go to work. Right? In other words, the worldly reality is absolutely nothing on its own terms. The worldly reality only exists as a tetzah, as a consequence of the divine reality. That's really all the world is. The world is simply the world on its own terms is an illusion. The only thing that's really here is the divine terms. But when a student of Alter Rebbe looks at the Torah, how does he treat the Torah? The exact opposite way. When a chassid looks at the Torah, he doesn't say, let me find the truth of this thing, because the Torah is like the Hashem's chachma is like a ray of the sun in the sun, so it's nothing. When we look at the Torah, we treat it the opposite way. Torah is like a ray of the sun in the sun because it's absolutely one with Hashem. Which is why when a chassid keeps the Torah, he doesn't keep it according to his own reason, according to his own understanding. He doesn't keep it to accomplish some end. We don't keep the Torah because it's a nice thing to do, and because it civilizes the world, and because it makes us look very smart, right? We follow the Torah because, and we treat the Torah as absolutely one with Hashem. The Torah is an end unto itself, right? The Torah is totally united with Hashem himself, and that's how a chassid treats the Torah. So we see in the difference between how we treat Hashem's wisdom and the world, the way in which it's the opposite metaphor. The world is the ray of the sun and the sun because it's nothing on its own terms. The Torah is the ray of the sun and the sun because it is totally united with Hashem, is totally one with Hashem on its own terms. And so even though we can't really understand the unity of Hashem with his wisdom, this is the metaphor, the ray of the sun and the sun, that the Alter Rebbe gives us to understand a little bit this unity. We're given permission to talk about Hashem's wisdom as the ray of the sun and the sun, as a light. Just as the ray of light in the sun is really all there is the sun, because the light becomes the sun within the sun. So too, even though Hashem's wisdom seems infinitely removed from him and infinitely lower than him, right? Hashem's wisdom seems to be a defined thing. How can a Torah, which a human being can even understand a little bit, right? How can that Torah be absolutely one with Hashem, who is totally beyond the realm of understanding? And the answer is, it's like the ray of the sun in the sun. That's the answer. The answer to understand that unity is by understanding the unity of the ray of the sun in its own source, right? That is the metaphor to understand a little bit.
But why do we need that metaphor? Because there's specific instructions. God says, Torah tzivah lanu Moshe. So it was like given directly from God.
Sure.
The fact that God created the sun, it's for our benefit, not because He wanted to get the sun just for the sake of the sun. Torah is given just because God created it specifically for us to use.
Yeah, but so the sun is not created for our benefit, you're saying?
It does. But this is something that, okay, have the sun. Enjoy the sun. The sun will make you day and night.
Right.
But the Torah is like, this is the way you should live. This is the Torah, this is the mitzvah, this is everything that I want you to exist by or with.
So you're saying that the sun is not really a good metaphor. But the truth is that we're not using every aspect of the sun as the metaphor. We're only using the aspect of the understanding how the light is absolutely one with its source. Because the purpose of the sun is to shine, and the purpose of the light is to reveal and to shine forth from the sun. And within the body of the sun, these two things are one thing.
It's true, but
that's the metaphor.
Parasha, Moshe spoke, specifically of do not work the sun and the moon, because these were the source of all idol work.
Don't worship the sun and the moon.
Because
course.
this is the source of everything.
Of course.
Obviously, it's like, sometimes we give the examples, like, you go to a restaurant and the waiter is giving you good food.
Yes.
Say, you created such good food, but it's not him. He just serves at the food.
But the Alter Rebbe is not saying, God forbid, to worship the sun.
God forbid, that doesn't even come into mind.
Right.
But the fact that, Torah is given by God, and this is actually God wisdom presented to us,
right?
Which is very much different.
I understand, but the question is how can the Torah be an actual expression of Hashem? How can it possibly be?
It must be.
How can it be? I agree, it must be, but also how can it be? That's the problem, right? The problem is that it must be, but how can it be? Can you understand how it can be? That's
Absolutely.
The question. Why?
Because the difference between the sun and the ray of the sun, that this is, as I said, the sun is the ma'or, this is a source of light, even though it doesn't contain the light, but the light comes from it.
Yeah.
Torah was specifically made in a way for us to get Dvar Hashem.
I'm not sure I follow.
I cannot even explain it.
In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the metaphor of the ray of the sun and the sun is meant to help us understand how the Torah can possibly be united with Hashem Himself if the two things seem so completely different one from the other, right? That's the question this metaphor is helping us answer, more or less. It's very complicated. I'm simplifying it greatly, but that is, in some level, that is what the metaphor of the ray of the sun and the sun is meant to explain to us. The question is Hashem is infinitely above wisdom, which with regards to the Torah, we would say Hashem is infinitely above the Torah, which, if you think about it, makes perfect sense that he's infinitely above the Torah. The Torah is something we can even understand. The Torah tells me to put on tefillin. That's extremely mundane. Why? How can Hashem be absolutely one with a sentence that says put on tefillin? You creature of flesh and blood. Doesn't make any sense, right? On the other hand, we know that the Torah is an expression of Hashem. It's emanated, right? It's not like the sun. You're right. The sun is a creation. The sun at some level is made as a creation, as we would say in Yiddish, far sich, la'atzmo, right? The sun is created as a being with its own being. It's created as a self-contained thing. That's what Bria Yesh Ma'ayin means. It's created something from nothing. The Torah is not created something from nothing, we're saying. We're saying the Torah is Hashem's wisdom. The Torah is an expression of what he is. Now the question is so if he is infinitely above the commandment to tell me to wear tefillin, yet somehow the commandment to tell me wear tefillin is an expression of exactly what he is. How can both of those things be true? To answer this question, the Alter Rebbe says, really you can't understand it. It's something that's only for Emunah. But there's a slight metaphor which will help us a little bit, which is the idea of the ray of the sun and the sun. The relationship of the commandment to put on tefillin in the Torah with Hashem, so to speak, is the relationship of the ray of the sun and the sun. That even though the ray is really not the same as the sun, or at least it doesn't appear to be the way it shines into the world, when the ray is within its source, right, the ray has absolutely no identity whatsoever. It's absolutely one with Hashem. That's what Alter Rebbe is saying here.
Let me try. So we cannot have the ray of the sun without having the sun.
Correct.
About Torah, so what is the Torah? It's absolutely not the sun, because the sun is like an element. Torah is Dvar Hashem.
Right, Chochmas Hashem.
Right.
But that makes the question stronger, not the question weaker, right? That's the basis. That's the basis of the whole difficulty, right? That it's an expression of Hashem. If the Torah was a nivra, right, Chas v'Shalom, which Chassidus would negate in the strongest terms, if the Torah was a creation, simply another thing that God created, separate from Him, we wouldn't have this whole question in the Alter Rebbe, right? Because it doesn't have to express Him. Right? This is what we said a few weeks ago, that it's actually harder to understand how Hashem emanates his wisdom than to understand how he creates an elephant, right? Because the elephant at least has some semblance of its own reality, it's its own thing. The whole difficulty of understanding Hashem's chachma is that his chachma is meant to express him even though he is infinitely removed from, which is another way of saying he has no connection with chachma at all, and yet the chachma expresses him. How can both of those things be true? That's the question we're dealing with.
Torah is like a bridge. Unlike the sun, which is like an element. The sun stands by itself. The fact that we know that God is creating the sun every single moment, this is one thing. But Torah is like a bridge.
Right.
Torah, by own existence, is almost like doesn't even exist. It's only a path for us, to get Dvar Hashem. So even though it exists, it's like, the purpose of its existence, it's only to serve us to get like a communication of God. I
think that we've, which is very easy to do, so it's not really your fault, but I think that we've twisted it around and come out backwards. I think the opposite of what you're saying is actually correct, or at least the opposite of what you're saying is what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying punkt verkehrt. He's saying exactly the opposite. He's saying the Torah is not created, emphatically not created just for us. On the contrary, the Torah is not even created. The Torah is not something separate from him, right? He and the Torah are absolutely one.
That's why I call it a bridge, because it's like a communicator for us.
But how can he himself exist as a bridge?
He doesn't exist as a bridge at all.
But the Torah and him are absolutely one.
It's Dvar Hashem, it's not Hashem.
But the Dvar Hashem and Hashem are absolutely one. I wouldn't say Dvar Hashem because that will confuse things too much. I would say Chachmas Hashem. Okay. And Chachmas Hashem and Hashem are an absolute achdus. To the extent the Alter Rebbe is going to say, if we get a chance to read it, the Alter Rebbe is going to say that Chachmas Hashem doesn't even have its own name. It's not Illa B'Shem Klal. It's just Hashem. That's all there is here. Right? So it can't be a bridge for us, right? Because it's just Hashem.
So you compare the Torah to the sun?
What?
Can you compare the Torah to the sun?
We're actually comparing Torah to the light of the sun. For those who are, if you follow the metaphor, the Torah is compared to the light of the sun. The sun is Hashem in the metaphor. The sun is Hashem in the metaphor. The Torah, the wisdom of Hashem, is the ray. And we are explaining that the ray, when it's in the sun, is absolutely one with the sun to the extent that there's no difference between the two. That's what the Alter Rebbe
It's
said.
very hard to understand because when you look at the ray of the sun, this is the final destination. Because what is the sun made for? To produce the ray of the sun.
Right.
Once you get the ray of the sun, you got it.
Right.
Torah is something that we say it has 70 faces. You cannot see the Torah as like the ray because it's not the final thing. It's like it's only something we get many out of or more out of.
I agree. So the metaphor is only meant to be precise in a very limited way, as I said before. It's not meant to be precise in all ways. The Torah is not like a ray of the sun in every aspect. The Torah is like a ray of the sun in the specific sense that the Torah in its source, which is Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the infinite one, Hashem, the Torah in its source, in Hashem as he is infinitely removed from wisdom, is absolutely identical with that source. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying.
Well, essentially, the Torah is the only thing that's constant. Everything else changes.
Yes, I wouldn't say necessarily the only thing, but that's certainly true of the Torah, for sure.
Again, the words are not changing, but the meaning, every day we come with a new meaning.
It's a whole other question.
That's an interpretation.
That's a whole other question. That's a whole other question. That's a whole other question, right? It gets even worse. Because if you think about it, right, Hashem gives the Jew the Bechira Chavshis. So Avram theoretically had a choice not to have the Akedah and not to bring Yitzchak as a sacrifice. And yet the Torah is eternal and as eternal as Hashem, right? And therefore the Akedah was something that was pre-written, wasn't written by Avram's actions. Right? We've discussed this before in this class. We've touched on this before, that there's two Torahs, which is really the key. There's the Torah as it is Lamaila and the Torah as it descends Lamata, are two very different things. And here we're really talking about the Torah as it is Lamaila. So it's really not as bad as it first appears, but once you actually get into the details, the point is that it's a good question. That's the point. The point is, in other words, that's the sort of question you should be asking. You should be asking if the Torah is absolutely one with Hashem. And I absolutely believe this 100%, that the Torah is the wisdom of Hashem, and the wisdom of Hashem is absolutely united with Him to the extent that you can't even distinguish between the two. Right, the Torah in its source. Then how can the Torah be so seemingly contingent? How can it speak about things that happen in time? How can it speak about things that happen in our world, right? That's a very good question. It's not the question Alter Rebbe was talking about in Tanya. That's a very, very good question, which is spoken about elsewhere in Chassidus at great length. An excellent question, right? How can you have both of these things be true about the Torah? But this is a stepping stone to that question. In other words, the better you understand what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, the stronger those questions become and the more you need an answer, which is why Chassidus speaks about it at such great length, right? So this is the foundation. Understand this first, and then those are all very good follow-up topics, right? Once you understand how one Hashem and His wisdom are, you can begin to really appreciate how radically strange it is that Hashem gave us a Torah that we can understand that seems to be speaking about worldly things, and that's in a very good position to be, right? Similar to how earlier in Tanya we ended the chapter on a question, and we asked how can it end on a question, and because the question is how can the world really exist, and we said that's a good question to sleep on. Right, that's a good question to have. How can the world really exist? Similar here. If your question is, the Torah is absolutely one with Hashem, so how can it speak about worldly things and be so mundane? That's a good question to have. Very good question. Okay.
Also, Israel is also one with Hashem. All three, right? Israel,
let us read. We are going to be on page... Second.
The fact that they're one.
Let's start here. We're going to be on the bottom, the second to last line on 962. Second to last line on 962. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe, precisely in this manner and even more so, are the traits of the Holy One, blessed be He, and His will and His wisdom in the world of Atzilus, in the world of emanation, right? Just as the ray of the sun is totally one with the sun, to the extent that in the sun you simply call it luminary, you simply call it ma'or, there is only the source of light, there is no light, because they're absolutely one. So too are the traits of Hashem and His will and His wisdom in the world of Atzilus when they are emanated, His emanated traits, including His will and His wisdom. Im mahusay v'atzmusay, their unity with His essence and being, kaviyachol, so to speak. Hamislavesh b'seichem u'misyached imayim b'tachlis hayichud, which is His very being is enclosed within them and united with them in an absolute unity. Top of 963. Because they are drawn forth and emanated from Him, may be blessed al derech mashal, like the way the light extends forth from the sun. Right? In other words, the Alter Rebbe is saying this is the nimshal. This is what it's a metaphor for. Just as the ray of the light is in the sun, so is Hashem's wisdom within Atzmusay u'Mahusay. Mahusay v'Atzmusay. He puts them in that order, I'm not sure why. So too they are in Mahusay v'Atzmusay, in His essence and being. Hashem's wisdom in Hashem's infinite being, is like the ray of the sun in the sun. In other words, they are absolutely one. Right?
It's kind of hard to grasp, because if you look at the chokhmah that comes out of Torah as like the ray that comes out of the sun, it's
not the chokhmah that comes from Torah. The ray is the Torah. If we're comparing it to Torah, the ray is the Torah. The Torah itself is the ray.
In that case, you compare God to the sun?
Correct. That's what the metaphor is. Yes. That's the mashal. So as the ray of the sun is in the sun, so is the wisdom of Hashem, which we've been calling the Torah to make it more, to get a better feeling, a better sense of what we're talking about. So too is the wisdom of Hashem in Hashem. And what do we mean? We don't mean that the Torah is nothing in Hashem, like we would have said in chapter 3. We mean specifically the Torah and Hashem are one, right? Not that the Torah is God forbid, an illusion on its own terms, essentially, right? A shell over the true reality. On the contrary, what do we say? We say, that His very being is enclosed within the Torah and united with it, in His chachma.
And it's almost like apologizing.
Oh, 1 second. I haven't got to that part yet. So this is the truth of Hashem's wisdom. Now, you could ask the question, right? You could ask the question, for those who have been paying attention since chapter 9, which is extremely difficult to do. You could ask the question, but is the ray still really in the sun, right? When it comes to Hashem's wisdom? Because if you'll remember, how do we say Hashem's wisdom is emanated from Him? It's not emanated starting within Him. On the contrary, how does Hashem's wisdom come about? We explained it in the previous chapter. Remember, tzimtzumim. It's an emanation, but it is created at an infinite distance, right? With contractions, with self-concealment. Hashem removes Himself from His wisdom to an infinite degree, right? And we explained the 3 steps. There was the first tzimtzum, and tzimtzum ak, and tzimtzum dikna, right? The tzimtzum of the beard. There were all these different tzimtzumim. There were all these different self-concealments by which He removed Himself from His chachma. So it would seem that the ray is not even in the sun. Why is the metaphor for the ray in the sun? It seems that Hashem, the sun, in the metaphor, right, removes Himself from the ray. It should be the ray outside of the sun, right? Why is that not correct? You have this information already since chapter 7. Why do we not say that? Who can think of something from the distant past, back in chapter 7?
Well, we talk about perfume, that the smell of the perfume is like coming out of, but it's not the.
No, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about. That's not the key here. we're asking, the question is, it seems that Hashem's wisdom is removed from him through tzimtzumim, right? Or in the metaphor we would say, it seems that the sun and the light are in different places, right? The sun goes away in a process called tzimtzum, right? And only the light is left over. So how can we be comparing his wisdom to the light in the sun? The sun was mitzamtzem, it was self-contracted, it pulled away, it removed. See, the metaphor should be light outside of the sun. How can we say the light is still in the sun? He created it with tzimtzumim. That's the question. You already know the answer to this question. Thank you, Ronnie. The answer to the question is that the tzimtzum is non-literal. The tzimtzum is shaloi kipshutai, right? As we explained back in chapter 7, it's true he removes himself from the light, but how much does he really remove himself? Not at all, right? That the whole self-removal is really just a self-concealment, right? In other words, Hashem's infinite light, the source of his wisdom, the Ein Sof, is where? Everywhere. Leis asar panui minei. Right? I could teach you the song. We'll save the song for a different time when the recording's not out. A different time, an old Chassidic song. It's not a politically correct song. There's no place devoid of Hashem, right? Hashem's infinite presence is everywhere, including, really, before we were talking about how his infinite presence is even in our world. Right? But here, we're talking about Atzilus, it's almost like a Kal V'chomer, right? If he's even here, if his infinite presence is even here, all the more so where his wisdom is, right? In other words, the sun never really goes anywhere. All that goes anywhere is the perception of the sun, right? The sun is concealed. The sun never actually leaves, right? So the ray of the sun is always within the sun. So that's why that's the metaphor. So that's one question that you could ask. You could ask, why the ray of the sun in the sun? The answer is, the sun is really everywhere. The sun never leaves, according to the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe has already answered that question, so to speak. And so it turns out what the Alter Rebbe is really saying is that just as the light, when it's in the sun, is not called but it's called ma'ar. It isn't called light, it's called sun. So too Hashem's wisdom, Hashem's chachma, when it's within its source, when it's within Hashem, which is always, because its source is everywhere. What is it called? It's really not called chachma, it's called Ein Sof. It's called the infinite one. It's not properly called wisdom. It is properly called the infinite presence of God. Exactly what there was before he emanated his wisdom. Right? His wisdom is simply a further expression of the infinite presence of God. There is no distinguishing between these two. Hashem's wisdom is absolutely one with him. In other words, and that is why the Alter Rebbe says the Kabbalists call his emanation light. They call his emanation light because when it's within its source, it is the luminary. That's why it's called light. It's called light because within its source, it is the source of light. Right? In other words, a different way of putting this is that if you really understand the mechanics of emanation, if you understand what it means for a light source to emanate forth light, and you really think about that, you can attain a little bit, it's the best metaphor for understanding what it means that Hashem's wisdom and him, even though they're infinitely removed, are really absolutely one.
And there's even another problem.
Yeah.
The sun creates light. Great.
Yeah.
But so does a bulb. You take a bulb, it creates light, you look at the light, identical.
Right.
So
what? So what's the question?
I know.
What's the question?
It's kind of hard to understand because we look at the ray of the sun.
You're looking at
No. But what I'm trying to understand the point you're trying to say. And therefore,
I'm having difficulties with even trying to compare the ray of light to the Torah. It's like it's so remote one from each other.
Why do we call? Okay, back to basics. What do we mean when we say Hashem's chachma is netzal? What do we mean when we say his wisdom is netzal, is emanated? What does that mean? it means you have a source, which is not the thing that is emanated. That's why it's an emanation and not a hispashtus, right? Hispashtus means an extension of the thing itself. This is a hispashtus, right? This is not an emanation. This is my arm moving over there, right? The Hashem's wisdom is not him moving over there, whatever that would mean. What is his wisdom? His wisdom is emanation. Emanation means there's a source, right? And then there's an expression of that source. That's what it means in the most basic sense. That is the only sense in which we're comparing the Torah to light, really. That's the only sense in which we're comparing the Torah to light. You have a source, and you have the expression of that source. The Alter Rebbe is simply saying that when you actually think of actual physical light, which is one form of emanation, you will note, if you really contemplate it, of the way that the light of the sun is within the sun. And the truth is that it's true in some sense with any light source, to some extent. The sun is a good metaphor because the sun's entire being is a being of light, which is what we're really emphasizing here, and it's easier to understand in that sense, right? But when you understand the way the light is in its source, you understand a little bit how the expression of Hashem is totally united with Hashem, because the source is everywhere, and the emanation is always within its source, and therefore we would conclude, what is Chachmas Hashem? It is Hashem himself, even though he is not a being of Chachma. That's really always the caveat, right? As we're going to read further, that's really what the Alter Rebbe is about to say. Continues the Holy Alter Rebbe, the second line of 963. Says the Alter Rebbe, however, it is not exactly like the ray from the sun, right? And you could have predicted this was coming, because last chapter the Alter Rebbe already said you can't understand this, which means that every metaphor that he's making is going to be imperfect. The metaphor is not going to capture the idea, and the Alter Rebbe is going to explain to us why. The way it works by God is distant and wondrous above our comprehension. Because his ways are above our ways. His ways are far beyond our ways of being. In other words, in truth, these things are really incomparable. And I keep mentioning why. Right? Think back to last week. What was the essential difference? Again, we mentioned it in our review as well. What's the essential difference between the metaphor of the ray of the sun and the sun in chapter 10 and the metaphor of the ray of the sun and the sun in chapter 3? The essential difference is how we treated the sun, right? And the key was, in chapter 10, we defined the sun as a ma'or, right? That's the one-word summary. We define the sun as a source of light. In other words, how is the light able to be totally one with its source to the extent that we call them even by the same name when it's within its source, right? The way that that's possible is because the entire purpose of the source is to shine. The entire purpose of the light is to express the source, and when they're in the same place, those things totally overlap. There's no distinguishing one between the other. All the source is light, and all the light is its source, right? Because the source exists to express light, and the light exists to express its source. So in other words, in the same place, it's all one thing, right?
Within the source.
Exactly, it's nullified within the source, but not like in chapter 3 when it's nullified within the source and it's not there because the source is fundamentally different from it, right? It's nullified within the source because the source is exactly the same as it in chapter 10, right? The source, the sun, is defined as the source of light. That's what ma'or means. The sun is nothing other than that which produces light. So when the light is within the source, there is no separate existence of light. There is simply the source. Light folds into the source. It's part of the definition of the source, is the light. Right? You can now, when we apply this metaphor to Hashem, you see instantly why this cannot work. This metaphor can't work. Why? Because what that would mean is that the purpose of Hashem is to emanate wisdom. Hashem exists and is defined by emanating wisdom, right? Which we absolutely reject, right? The Alter Rebbe says in chapter 8 and chapter 9 that this is absolutely not an idea. Hashem is infinitely removed from wisdom. He is not defined by emanating wisdom in any way, right? So we see that the metaphor cannot work, right? The whole metaphor of the Alter Rebbe rests on the idea that the source is defined by producing its emanation, right? But when we talk about Hashem's wisdom, not only is Hashem not defined by producing wisdom, he is in fact infinitely removed from producing wisdom. He and wisdom do not intersect in any way. Right? And the truth is that it's not just even wisdom specifically. Really, the truth is that you can't even define him as an emanator at all. Right? Because, and you'll remember, this will take us back to our chapter 8 days, all those weeks ago. We were younger and so much more innocent back when we were studying chapter 8. Back in chapter 8, we discussed how to say that he's above wisdom is really to say that he's above all description by language. You may remember this discussion, right? Because all language is metaphorical, right? To call him a name or define him by a word, right, which has another meaning, basically. To define him by a word that has another meaning is to say that he and something other than himself have something in common, which is to say that he exists as a form of wisdom, because that's what wisdom is. Wisdom is how things fit together in this metaphorical sense by language. You may remember this whole discussion. So it comes out that if he is above wisdom, and if he's infinitely above being defined as a source of wisdom, he is infinitely above being defined as a ma'or at all, no matter what he produces. Right? It's not just the fact that it's wisdom that he's emanating and he's infinitely above wisdom. Really what we mean when we say he's infinitely above wisdom is that he's infinitely above being defined for any purpose or in any terms other than himself. Even to call him ma'or, even to call him luminary, the word simply cannot apply to God. You cannot define God as a luminary, right? Because that means that God can be understood in terms of this idea of illumination, right? We reject this whole notion that God can be so defined, right? God forbid to say that Hashem's purpose is to shine. In fact, God forbid to say that God has a purpose other than God himself. Right?
That's why I was struggling with, because the comparison is like, making things too clear, but not fair. It's like impossible.
So you have to have both. You have to have both things in mind simultaneously, right? That the metaphor doesn't work, and on the other hand, it's the metaphor of the Alter Rebbe given to understand this thing, at least a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm. What's that not fair?
So he shines.
Life's not fair.
Really?
So Hashem shines without being a luminary, is essentially what we're saying. We're saying that Hashem shines and he emanates forth Chachma without ever being a ma'or. There is an ur. The ur can only come from a ma'or. The light can only come from a luminary. And yet, Hashem is infinitely removed from being a luminary. God forbid to say Hashem is the luminary. And then you say, but then where does the light come from? The answer is from Hashem. He's just not a luminary, right? He emanates the light, and yet the light is not emanated from him in a way that defines him as a luminary, right? But find any other way to define him by saying light emanates from him, right? That's the issue. That's why only faith can understand this, right? The issue is that this light is emanated from him in a way that he is not at all defined as an emanator, right? And how can that be if the entire identity of the light is to express him? So you have a true light, you have a true you have a true expression which is netzal, it's emanated, right? It truly is an emanation. It truly expresses Hashem. It is absolutely one with Hashem, and yet Hashem is infinitely removed from emanating it.
It's a secular
Right?
reference.
It goes all the way around, and you can see the contradiction. This is why the Alter Rebbe said at the end of the previous chapter that this is a raza de mehem nusa. This is the secret of faith. This is not something that intellect can properly understand, which is why the truth is he warned us, he gave us fair warning before he said this whole metaphor, that this is only to ease the ears, to give you a little sense, right, of what's going on. Rabbi Yoel actually makes a beautiful connection. Rabbi Yoel says that in the previous chapter, we already said that about Hashem's wisdom, that this is something that how is it translated in the lessons in Tanya? The savants, the Kabbalistic savants can understand, right? We said the students of Kabbalah can understand Hashem's wisdom. And then the Alter Rebbe immediately said, but no one can understand it. So we had, how could both be true? And the answer is that the study of what no one can understand is how his wisdom is united with him. What Kabbalah can understand is how can wisdom even come from him in the first place? Never mind how it's united with him. Right? So we said Kabbalah can understand how wisdom comes from him in the first place, even if no one can understand how that wisdom is totally united with him and to be one. Right? So Rabbi Yoel notes that really here, when the Alter Rebbe is bringing this metaphor, it's really the same notion. Right? The metaphor says, what does Hashem produce? Light, right? That's what you can understand with the Kabbalah. With the Kabbalah, you can understand what is Hashem's wisdom. It's like light. And by understanding that it's like light, you can understand a little bit its unity with Hashem. Even if, ultimately, you run into all of these contradictions which no human mind can comprehend. Right? So Rabbi Yoel says that when we're bringing in this chapter the fact that the Kabbalists are allowed to call it light, that's really the same thing, or in connection with what the Alter Rebbe said in the previous chapter, that the Kabbalists can understand what it is, but not how it's united with Hashem. Right? So once you understand what it is, which is light, you can understand at least a little bit, as a result, what it means that it's united with Hashem, although not entirely.
What was that word that you used?
Oh, savant.
Yeah,
This was from the lessons in Tanya last week. It was a weird word then, and it's still interesting. Or not from last week, pardon me, from the previous chapter. He means Kabbalists. It's people who know Kabbalah. Savant is like a young genius, is a special genius, is a savant.
Prodigy.
Yeah, child prodigy.
Also, it's an English word.
Yeah. It's English from the French. That's why.
Borrowed from French.
Okay. No.
English from French, so it's too removed. It's two tzimtzumim. It's two tzimtzumim. It's French and English.
But the accent like Jean-Paul Belmondo.
Let's continue reading.
Savant.
Let's continue reading. Page 963 in the middle, where it says the 5th of Tammuz. Nevertheless, to modulate for the ear. This is the excellent translation in here. Nishma v'nisbeinin mimashal shemesh hameyuchad ubatwa makere. We comprehend and contemplate the metaphor of the light of the sun, which is united and nullified within its source. Keeping in mind that when we say nullified here, we mean united with, not nothing, right? The ena ila b'shem b'fnei atzmei, and it does not even. This is key to understanding this. It does not even attain its own name. The light of the sun and the sun. I've been saying it repeatedly, but here's where the Alter Rebbe actually says it inside. The light of the sun and the sun does not attain its own name. We don't call it light. We call it sun. Right, that's the point. Rak shem hamakar levada. It only has the name of its source. Kach. So too all the traits of Hashem, and His will and His wisdom, do not attain any of these names at all. Calling it Hashem's wisdom is actually false. Why even call it Hashem's wisdom? It's absolutely united with Him. Why does it even deserve its own name? It's like the ray of the sun and the sun. All that's here is Hashem.
No, we already said it. I mean, it's impossible here because we do not know God's wisdom and we cannot even use it.
No, we don't understand what it is, but he's saying here it doesn't even get its own name. Right? In other words, there can be something I don't understand what it is, but it at least is a thing, right? It gets its own category.
No, but you cannot call it wisdom because God's wisdom is...
No, but he's saying here not just you don't call it wisdom, he's saying we don't call it anything. That's the point.
Right. Because I mean, if it's not wisdom, what else can you call it?
God. No, that's not the point he's making.
But everything is
No,
God.
that's not the point he's making.
That's not the definition.
No. That's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying we don't call it Chachma because what else would you call it? In fact, Chachma is the most proper name, and we'll get back to that because obviously the Torah calls it Chachma. In other words, this can't possibly be the last word on the matter. Just 1 second. It's a little more complicated. What we are saying though is that when the ray of the sun is in the sun, when Hashem's Chachma is within Hashem, which is always, by the way, when Hashem's Chachma is within Hashem, when the ray of Chachma is within Ein Sof, is within the Or Ein Sof, His infinite light, it doesn't get its own name, right? Just like we know that light is different than the sun, But the Alter Rebbe is saying, but when the light is in the sun, all there is sun, because the sun is light. The sun is illuminated. That's what the sun is, right? So too, Hashem is his Chachma. Right? His Chachma is Hashem. So when his Chachma is within its source, when the Chachma is within Ein Sof, why call it Chachma? It's Ein Sof. The same way, why call it light? Call it the sun, right? That doesn't mean the sun is dark. It means the sun is so light that you don't even call it light because it's the sun. You understand what I'm saying?
When God created, he didn't call it Shemesh, he called it Hamor Gadol and Hamor Katan.
Sorry?
When God created the sun,
yes.
he called it Hamor Gadol.
Correct.
He didn't call it the sun.
Correct.
So that's actually
when I'm saying sun in English, I mean Mahar Gadol in Hebrew. That's what I mean.
I have a question.
Yeah. Yeah. Therefore.
He uses chokhmah to do stuff, to create stuff.
Yeah. And
so how does it
I'm not sure I follow.
place together?
It's like
I just told you the Torah says he has Chachma. The Torah says he has Chachma in 30 million places. It's not just that pasuk that proves that Hashem has Chachma.
Is actually God, and it doesn't deserve to be called even in a different name.
Yeah.
So how can he use something that is, when he does something, why does it need Chokhmah as intermediate?
I ask you a question. How does Ein Sof come about?
How does Ein Sof come about?
From Hashem.
it's a metaphor.
No,
Whatever it is, how does it come about from Hashem?
Tzimtzum.
What?
How does it come about?
Yes.
How does
Hashem have a Ein Sof? Where does that come from? Let me just skip to the end. The end is that wherever that comes from, that's where the Chachma comes from also. In other words, Hashem's already created things other than himself before we even get to this level. He has an infinite light, you know what I'm saying? Right. So in other words, wherever those things came from, his Chachma came from also. It's not that you know, because what you're saying is that the Chachma Asisa implies that his Chachma is somehow separate from him because he's using it to do something. Right, but that problem doesn't start here. In other words, Hashem already is making things other than himself and using things. You could ask the question: so how does the Ein Sof create Chachma? Right? It should be Kulam Ba'Ein Sof Asisa. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. In other words, I don't think that's germane. But your more general point that the Torah calls the Torah calls Hashem's Chachma by the name Chachma. In other words, clearly there is something which is Chachma, as distinguished from Chesed, and as distinguished just as simply from Ein Sof, right? It is both this different from Chesed, which is a different emanation, and it's different than Ein Sof, which is the source of both, is clearly true. Right? So don't try and understand the whole Chassidus from these two lines in Tanya. Listen to what the two lines are saying. That's all I'm asking. Yes? What are you saying, Yael?
There is a very strong point over there. Why?
Yeah.
Because we obviously understand that we don't understand God's wisdom.
Right.
But God made that wisdom for us to be understood. That's why we call it God's wisdom, because He made it for us to understand.
We are saying that God's wisdom is not really made at all. God's wisdom is totally united with Him to the extent that it has no identity other than Him Himself.
Right, because otherwise it would be like defining God, and you cannot define God because Chokhmah does not define God. But after many tzimtzumim, He created that something for us to understand. Because otherwise, how can you call God Chacham, Gibor?
So then that's not God's Chachma you're talking about. That's something else that comes about after many tzimtzumim.
Of course.
So I'm talking about God's Chachma. And God's Chachma is not Ela B'Shem Klal.
But
right?
we said that in the fact that you said that you do not understand God, this is almost a sin by itself. Because the fact that you say that you don't understand Chachma of God, that means you understand something of God, which is not true. You understand nothing.
I agree that, in other words, I agree that according to what we're saying here, to understand Chachmas Hashem is the same as saying to understand Hashem. I agree with that point. Absolutely. But the thing is that Chachmas Hashem is not even really Chachmas Hashem then. Why even call it Chachmas Hashem? Chachmas Hashem is no different from Chasdei Hashem, first of all. And second of all, it's no different from Ein Sof. It's no different from Hashem's infinite light itself, from its source, right? Never mind Chachma. It's no different from the Hashem who is infinitely above wisdom, which is really what we're saying, right? That's what we say when the ray of the sun is in the sun, right? Really all that's here is the sun, because the sun, the entire identity of the sun is to shine. What is the sun? All that's here is ma'ar. All that's here is luminary, right? Similarly, all that's here is Ein Sof. All that's here is the infinitude of Hashem. There is no Chachma here, right? Because the infinitude of Hashem is totally one with that Chachma. That's what Alter Rebbe is saying.
But there's a big difference here.
What's the difference?
The Or and Sof, with a lot of respect to all the rabbis, this is something that the rabbis invented.
Pardon me?
When we call Or and Sof, God calls himself Or and Sof.
Sorry?
God.
What do you mean?
It's not himself, it's Or and Sof.
I know.
What do you mean?
In the Torah, nothing is mentioned about Or and Sof.
In what Torah?
Our Torah.
Which Torah?
The
What do
Torah that
you
was
mean? The
the Torah.
Chumash?
Yeah.
There's a lot of things we know about God that aren't mentioned in the Chumash.
But
I'm not sure what the...
No, but Chokhmah is mentioned over there.
very good. And?
So
Therefore...
At least, I mean...
So you're saying the Chachma should take precedence and we should throw out the entire idea of our Ein Sof?
No, I didn't
Oh,
say
that's not what you said. So what are you saying?
Wait, that's coming accepted.
No, I'm saying that, there's a difference between the two terms. Chokhmah is something which is coming directly from, the written words of the Torah. And Or and Sof, it is something that, it's almost like, an example for us to understand.
You're not ready yet to study this section of the Tanya, if that's what you think. That's the only answer. The Alter Rebbe spends no time establishing the idea that there is Or Ein Sof. The Alter Rebbe is assuming that you, as a student of Tanya, are on the same page as him. And the same page as him roughly means that you're a Talmud of the Kabbalah of the Arizal. If you believe in the Kabbalah of the Arizal, the Alter Rebbe can talk to you. If you don't believe in the Kabbalah of the Arizal, you have to go and figure out how to believe in it before you come to the Alter
The Or
Rebbe.
and Sof is not metaphor.
What do you mean a metaphor?
Huh? No?
What do you mean by a metaphor? The Or Ein Sof means the infinite presence of Hashem. The Or Ein Sof is God.
Very true. But you cannot compare the word God into the word Or and Sof. It's like...
I'm not sure what you mean. The Or Ein Sof is very real. You're asking, why do you call it Or? Is that what you're asking?
No, this is part of the question as well. Because this is for us easier to understand. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be able to understand anything. That's why, that word came. That kind of, defining or trying for us to understand.
Or Ein Sof is a godly reality. Is a godly reality is the infinite presence of Hashem. It's a godly reality. It's not a metaphor. I'm not sure what you mean by saying it's a metaphor.
ככה בתהילים.
Or and Sof.
לכל תכלה ראיתי קץ. יש דברים ש...
I'm not sure what you mean by saying it's a metaphor, but if it means that you only believe in the Chachmas Hashem because it mentions it in the Chumash, and you don't believe in Or Ein Sof because it's not mentioned in the
I didn't
Chumash.
say that they don't believe. It's not a matter of believing or not. It's a matter that this is like an example for us to better understand the existence or...
Where does it say tzimtzum in the Chumash?
It's not.
I don't understand. 1 second. What's it meant to be a metaphor for? Just clarify it for me. Without Ronnie's help.
Ronnie is only making that more difficult. It's gotten
You
worse.
also noticed. Yeah.
No, I actually, it's very hard for me to understand because, it's not because of the lack of words,
Yeah.
but because, of the lack of words to understand the concept. Obviously, I understand what does it mean, Or and Sof. I clearly understand it. Because it is so big, especially when you use the word infinite, it's like, how can you even get closer to explain infinite, which is infinite?
There's a lot of Torah about understanding at least something about the Or Ein Sof, I would think. No?
Of course, but when you mention that word, you only
Yeah.
understand how much you don't understand. Because
Sure.
You don't understand the infinite.
Sure, I agree. If that's all you mean, that we don't understand what the Or Ein Sof is, then we're in 100% agreement. It's when you start saying things like the Or Ein Sof is only a metaphor that I don't really understand
No,
what you're
because when
talking
you
about.
call Chokhmah, even Chokhmah, the Chokhmah that we see here, it's a little bit of what we call Chokhmah.
Correct,
because we don't even understand.
correct. It's a name. The name is an accurate name. It's a Torah name. In other words, the name is not a metaphor. The name of the thing is the name of the thing as it is. Hashem's Chachma is Chachma.
So you're
What that means may be very difficult for us to understand. The exact same thing is true of Or Ein Sof. Or Ein Sof is 100% real. Its name is Or Ein Sof. What is Or Ein Sof? Okay, not such an easy question to answer. I agree. If that's all you mean, then I think we're 100% on the same page. I just don't think that's what you were saying before. You were saying Or Ein Sof is only a metaphor. I don't know what that means.
You said what I wanted to say. The only thing I was
Yeah.
saying that Chokhmah is written in the Torah, while Or Ein Sof is not written there.
But I don't see the. I don't see the. See, now we're back to where we were
Because
before.
God is defining himself like in 13 ways. And Or Ein Sof is not one of them.
Chachma is also not one of them. of the 13 principles of the 13 things you're talking about anyway. Hashem calls himself a chacham elsewhere, but that doesn't bother me because I'm taking the whole Torah as a whole. I don't need to limit myself to the Chumash. And just as he calls himself chacham elsewhere, he calls himself Ein Sof elsewhere and or Ein Sof elsewhere, right? Like I said, the Alter Rebbe's assumption, and it's not your fault at all. In other words, this is an implicit assumption of the Alter Rebbe, that learning the second part of Tanya is sort of jumping into the deep end of Judaism. We're not starting from the Chumash, right? The Alter Rebbe is working off the assumption that the student is starting with the works of the Arizal. The Kabbalah of the Arizal, which discuss Ein Sof, which discuss the infinite nature of Hashem, and many, many, many of the other Kabbalistic concepts that are included in the work. And therefore, in other words, if the idea of if the question is, what is the source of the idea of Ein Sof? That's a very good question. That is not a question the Alter Rebbe is going to address, right? The Alter Rebbe assumes that is something that we've already dealt with for good or for ill before we come to the second part of Tanya. Just 1 second here. Let me see if this is a good spot to stop. I know we're over time. Just give me 1 second.
We're in OT.
You know what? This is actually a good place to stop. Let's stop it here. And God willing, next time I'll mark here where we're up to. God willing, next time we will continue with the other side, which the other side is that, of course, his Chachma has a name and is Ele B'Shem Klal, and he has a thing which is called Chachma, which is different than the thing called Chesed, and it's different than the thing called Or Ein Sof, and all these names are real. But the place where we're stopping now, what the Alter Rebbe has just said, is that it should be, and it is really, at least at one level, at least from one perspective, it is absolutely true that Hashem's Chachma is really indistinguishable from Or Ein Sof, from Hashem's infinite presence. Hashem's infinite presence and His Chachma are so one that really all there is Hashem's infinite presence. There is no Hashem's Chachma separate from it. Just like in the sun, in the metaphor, all there is the luminary, all there is the Ma'or. There is no light that's separate from it, because the whole identity of the Ma'or is to be light, right? Is to illuminate, is to express light. Good evening, is to express light and is to illuminate. So the two things are absolutely one thing. So too in Hashem's wisdom really doesn't deserve its own name. Hashem's wisdom is absolutely one with Ein Sof, and all that there is Ein Sof. And we will explain why it's all so much more complicated even than that next week.